Van was on the shiny studio floor when the velvet pouch split open. Gold beads flew like tiny stars. The live stream chat exploded. Some people sent hearts. Others typed in all caps, angry and scared. The crew moved fast. Security stood close, looking worried. Van picked up a bead that rolled under a light stand. He turned it and saw a tiny mark stamped on the metal. It was like a little smiling sign, but no jeweler used such a mark. Van fixed rings and read many stamps, so he felt the mark was wrong. Steph walked in like she owned the room. She held a new product and said a calm, set apology. Cameras kept rolling. Van's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown user read, "If only you knew what that sigil means." The words felt like a cold wind. Van put the bead in his pocket and watched Steph sign things for fans. The studio smelled like coffee and polish. Van felt a small knock inside him, like the start of trouble. He could not sleep that night. He kept thinking about the tiny mark and the dark message. A week earlier, Steph had come to the town with a bright smile and a plan. Her team set up a pop-up stall near the church. People lined up. Mothers, fathers, and kids watched as Steph opened boxes full of shiny things. She gave the mayor a self-polished spoon right on the church steps. Cameras and phones recorded every move. The town cheered and shared the videos online. The PDA sold extra raffle tickets. The pop-up went viral fast. The town felt proud to be on camera. But Baba Ade watched with a quiet face. He was a craftsman who loved wood and small work. When he held the spoon, it started to polish itself a little too fast. He frowned and felt the edge hum. Baba Ade whispered, "I have seen that mark before," but most people did not listen. The crowd laughed and took pictures. Steph's PR team gave the town discount codes and free things. The town smiled and liked the shine. Baba Ade closed his shop door slowly and kept the worry inside him. Van was used to small work at a small bench by a window. He fixed rings and learned how metal behaved. At a wedding, a ring he had mended snapped in two while the couple said their vows. Guests laughed, thinking it was a trick or a joke. The groom tried to hide his teeth when he smiled. Van took the broken ring home and looked at the tiny stamp inside. The mark was the same small smiling sign. He knew every hallmark and maker's mark in town. This one did not fit. Later, the wedding photographer checked the live stream and found a strange frame. A faint pattern flickered across the screen. It looked like the same mark, like a ghost on the video. Van printed the still image and clipped it to his wall. He kept the ring halves in a box and stared at them at night. He felt small and angry. Someone was changing small things in town, and that scared him. He began to watch other items more closely. The town still cheered Steph on, and the feeds kept growing. Van felt alone and needed help. At the mayor's speech, a perfume from Steph's brand turned the room into fog. The smoke looked pretty on camera. But the mayor began to cough and rub his eyes. People blamed pollen and said, "It's just allergies." After the event, Van found the perfume bottle left on a table. He turned it under his lamp and looked at the bottom near the barcode. The tiny smiling sign sat there again. Under it, a small phrase read, "Not for truth-telling." Van read the words and felt the hair on his arms stand up. In the box he found a torn return label sewn into the folds. He pulled it free and read a code, F&F07. Van did not know that code. It smelled like old cardboard and secrets. Steph made videos about care and fixes, and her people told stories of kindness. The town wanted to believe, so they cheered and shared. Van folded the label and slipped it into his pocket. He could not shake the feeling that the goods had a hidden side. He kept thinking of that tiny line, "Not for truth-telling." Tola ran the local news sheet. She loved paper and proof. Van walked into her office with the bead and the torn label. Tola looked at him with sharp eyes and took both items slowly. She liked mysteries the way others liked tea. Tola pulled a stack of invoices from a drawer and spread them on her desk. The papers showed odd names like Attention Raw and a company called Verified Praise LLC. They billed to a strange old address on the old road, a place people talked about in whispers. Tola clicked her tongue. Fulfillment and Fake Company, she said. They do not show up in regular lists. She loved a story that others missed. Tola promised to dig through old files and find who shipped the goods. Van felt less alone. He followed her out with a map and a list. The town still loved Steph's shine online. But Tola's pile of paper felt like truth on a table. Van tucked a paper copy into his jacket and felt the weight of facts in his hand. Baba Ade had been a woodworker his whole life. He made spoons and small bowls with care. He refused a nice money offer from Steph's people when they came to buy his craft. Baba Ade did not like the way they wanted to use his work. Van visited him at dusk and found him sanding a spoon. The shop smelled like wax and warm wood. When Van showed Baba Ade the smiling mark, the old man's hands stopped. He told a small story his mother had told him. Long ago, some traders stamped things with marks to collect people's thanks and names. Baba Ade said that when goods carry a mark like this, they take a little piece of the person who uses them. Then Baba Ade reached into a trunk and pulled out an old wooden stamp. It had the same small sign carved into it. The wood was smooth from use. Baba Ade tapped the stamp on the bench and said, "This mark is not for tax or maker. It is for taking." Van felt a cold stone in his chest. The old man refused to sell his work to people who wanted bark and not heart. The story fit like a piece of a larger puzzle. Kunnel was a quiet coder who read numbers like weather maps. He loved the hum of servers and the beat of data. Van found him in a small cafe typing with focus. Kunnel agreed to help and pulled up his screens fast. He showed Van graphs of spikes when Steph posted new unboxings. Each jump in likes matched an odd break in town items. Kunnel typed a line of code that looked like a warning. /consume. Authenticity, 0.73/. He said the data looked like a machine slowly eating small truths. His screen once glitched and in the static the smiling mark seemed to draw itself. Kunnel said, "When their follower count goes up, something in town loses shape." He spoke soft but serious words. Van listened and felt a plan form. Kunnel would watch the feeds and match the times. They would look for how the spikes tied to broken spoons and bent rings. The cafe buzzed around them, but their small table felt like a secret center. Van felt glad to have Kunnel's cold logic at his side. Steph did a public refund event and called it a Make It Right hour. Cameras lined up and lights shone down. People clapped when she returned goods and said sorry. For a short while, broken things looked whole on camera. The town cheered and said the brand had fixed its mistakes. But Van watched closely. He saw a bracelet fix under the camera's light and then split again when the frame switched. A viewer typed, "Did you see that?" Van clipped the moment and saved it. Tola put the moment on her list of odd things. Baba Ade shook his head and said the fixes were cheap tricks. Kunnel checked the stream's code and saw edits in the recording. The town wanted to believe in the happy ending. The team stitched the story so it looked neat and bright. But Van knew the cracks were still there. He felt like the fix was a light bandage on a deep cut. He kept the split bracelet in his pocket. He wanted to show someone, but he also wanted proof that would not be ignored. After the refund, things began to go wrong more often. Lamps blinked and forced people to say things they did not mean. A mug that stirred itself threw soup at a cake. Each mishap left a tiny mark on the skin where people held the items. The mark was faint but showed the small smiling sign. A child came home with a stamped carnival ticket and kept saying, "They asked for my name." The town noticed small losses. Old songs slipped from memory, recipes blurred, and a hush fell over people who once laughed loudly. Van saw the child's wrist and felt a new fear. Baba Ade checked the marks and said they were like soft brands. Kunnel traced the ticket back to Fulfillment and Fate Company. Tola printed a small article and ran it on the next page. People started to take pictures of things that felt like proof. The town was waking up slowly. Van stayed awake, thinking of all the small truths that could vanish if no one stopped the machine. A child seemed to vanish for a moment and came back different. He played and then returned saying he loved everything, though he did not remember his grandmother's jam recipe. Van found the boy's shoelace and saw a tiny metal tag sewn into the knot. The tag had the smiling sign and it hummed like a small machine when Van touched it. The sound made Van's teeth buzz. The boy could not remember the jam's taste, though he had helped make it. His mother cried at the sink and could not explain the empty place. Baba Ade told Van the tags were not just metal, they were keys. Tola put the tag story in the paper with caution. Kunnel checked the tag code and said the batch came from F&F Archive. Van wrapped the shoelace in cloth and kept it like a small, loud bell. He began to think that the town had given away tiny parts of itself for the shine they saw in feeds. That thought felt heavy and dangerous. Van knew the plan had to start soon. They drove to the old warehouse on the edge of town, their lights cutting the fog. A sign read Fulfillment and Fate, returns not accepted. The lot smelled like old glue and tired cardboard. Van, Baba Ade, Tola, and Kunnel slipped in through a side door. Inside, conveyor belts hummed and boxes rolled with soft thumps. Labels read strange things: delight, promise, approval. In a dark corner stood a brass filing cabinet with a label: contracts, signed in likes. Tola opened a drawer and paper light fell on yellowed contracts. A small smiling mark stamped the pages like a secret coin. Kunnel snapped photos and Baba Ade rubbed his chin. The warehouse felt like a throat holding a secret. They spread papers on a table and read until their eyes grew raw. The words spoke of trades that took names and gave shine. Van felt cold and very small. The conveyor kept moving as if the place had a heartbeat. They stood in the quiet and listened to a machine that ate truth like a thing that could not be trusted. Tola read the old contract aloud. The voice of the words felt heavy and old. The page promised, "We will offer wonders that reply as you command." It said the town's honest replies could be stored and sold. The paper had a clause in small, twisted language. Activation requires confession of a want. Van felt the room close around him. Baba Ade tapped the wooden stamp he had kept and shook his head. Kunal found terms that read like a trap. Names and first songs would become stock. The lights in the warehouse seemed to flicker like a warning. Tola's hands trembled a little as she put the page down. The group felt a new urgency. If the town spoke what it wanted during Steph's stream, the contract would take that truth. Van thought of the child who could not remember jam and of the tags humming like tiny servers. He folded the page, put it in his pocket, and told the others, "We must stop the reset." They moved deeper into the warehouse and found a small room filled with old objects. In the center stood a strange statue. It was part office lamp, part toy, and someone had labeled it Sponsorius. Paper clips hung like beads around its neck, and a tiny chip flashed in its chest. The room smelled of old perfume and dust. Baba Ade's hands trembled when he saw it. He told Van that old nursery rhymes once warned of a trickster that took what people gave and turned it into shine. Sponsorius had been made to look friendly and small, but its smile felt like a trap. On a shelf, a dusty camcorder played a video. Steph knelt in front of Sponsorius and whispered into its ear. Behind her, a counter called follower balance ticked up with each whisper. The numbers climbed like a staircase. Kunal traced thin cables from Sponsorius to a bank of old servers. The statue was not a toy. It fed on the soft things people gave it: names, songs, first promises. Tola recorded the camcorder with wide, quick breaths. She knew this tape would be proof that Steph had spoken to the shrine. Baba Ade tapped the wooden stamp and said, "This is worse than selling bad goods. This is stealing names." Van felt a cold, hard fear that made his hands shake. He realized Sponsorius had a face the town could not ignore. Kunal worked all night to crack a tiny QR code etched at Sponsorius's base. He fed the code into his old laptop and watched a wall of words appear. The page was a strange terms and conditions sheet written in tiny fonts and odd runes. It read in plain lines, "We supply delights. We collect veracity. Sign here. Your town's honest replies become stock." Van read the sentence and felt a cold knot. He had fixed many small things but never read words that asked people to trade truth for shine. Baba Ade wrapped his hands around a mug and tried not to shake. Kunal found a maintenance note that said, "Campaign reset scheduled for hometown stream." Tola recorded every word and stared hard at the screen. The old warehouse had a mirror server that saved copies called F&F Archive. The terms page had a clause that said the reset would trigger at a certain follower target during a big live event. The group felt fear like rain. If the town joined in a big cheer, their honest names would be taken. Van clutched the bead in his pocket and thought of the child who could not taste jam. He felt a steady anger bubble up that turned his fear into resolve. They went to confront Steph at the big event. Backstage smelled of hairspray and nerves. Steph smiled like someone who had practiced being kind for a long time. Van showed her the bead and the old contract. He asked her if she knew who Sponsorius was and what the reset meant. Steph's smile did not falter. She touched the bead like it was a prop and said softly, "I do not handle fulfillment. I only sign things my team brings me." Her manager hovered nearby with a legal pad and a ready line. Van noticed an email pinned on her clipboard that read, "Campaign reset tonight, hometown edition." The words burned like a hot coal. He told her the town would lose pieces of itself if the reset ran. Steph's eyes flicked for a second and then blanked into the practiced calm of a performer. She said, "Please do not interrupt the live." The security crew moved closer. Van felt small against the wall of smiles and rehearsed kindness. He left with his jaw tight and the plan in his head. If Steph would not stop the reset, he and the others would have to try and jam the machine themselves. Back at the workshop, Kunal drew a map of patterns on the wall. Each rise in Steph's follower count matched a small break in town things. A lamp, a spoon, a ring. Kunal plotted lines and times until the wall looked like a spider web. He played a recording that had come through their hidden number. A voice, warped by effects, said, "Tell them to say what they mean, or they'll trade what they love." Laughter followed the line like a cruel applause. The group felt a cold squeeze in their chests. They knew the reset target would lock comments if the town hit a follower goal. If comments froze, truth could not flow into the live feed. Baba Ade folded a piece of paper and placed it on the table. Tola made copies of the contracts and highlighted the clause that asked for names and first songs. Van felt the weight of it all. He thought of the child again, of jam that could be forgotten. He clenched his hands and said, "We will not let them take more." Everyone in the room nodded and set to work, their fear turning into a careful plan. They tried a first move. Tola slipped a small piece of evidence to a watchdog group that loved to tear scams apart. The group published a short piece naming Verified Praise LLC. People reacted fast and the company posted a denial, then said it would close. For one day the town relaxed. The stream seemed to calm and no items broke. Van felt hope like warm sun on his face. But the sun did not last. The next morning, new cracks crawled across old items and the smiling sign appeared on things bought before Steph's visit. Kunnel checked the watchdog servers and found a mirror backup in F&F archive. The system was not gone. It had copies and tricks to keep working. Tola cursed low and tight. Baba Ade rubbed his temples and said the old bargains had been built to last. Van felt anger and a kind of sadness that tasted like ash. They had won a battle but not the war. Sponsorius had found new mouths to feed. Baba Ade told the story of the founding trader again, but this time with more detail. He showed the town ledger where an ancestor had signed a deal for bright goods and left a mark like Sponsorius's. The ledger pages smelled of old ink and worry. Van saw his grandmother's locket and found the smiling sign tucked inside like a secret. A small note lay folded. "Do not unbox what you will own forever." The past had slipped into the present like water into a bottle. Tola wrote a careful piece about old bargains and how they can grow with new tools. Kunnel traced the server paths back through old festival machines and found signals that had been waiting to restart. Van felt the ledger's weight in his hands. The town's story, it seemed, had always had a price. He sat up late that night and planned a new move that would use something the machine did not like. Messy, true voices. They made a plan that felt like a small rebellion. The idea was simple and risky. Hijack Steph's live hometown stream and turn it into a truth hour. People would say real names, honest dislikes, and true small things. The team believed the machine could not turn this messy truth into sellable shine. Tola wrote invoices into lines of poetry. Baba Ade turned the nursery rhyme into a chant that might confuse old code. Kunnel made a patch that sent raw comments into the feed and tried to stop the freeze. Saad, Steph's quiet assistant, agreed to help. She promised to give them a backup feed and show camera blind spots. They called the plan #UnboxTruth and practiced handing the mic from hand to hand so the live could not auto-freeze voices. Van felt nervous but brave. He thought of the child who could not taste jam and placed a small ribbon with names into his pocket. The town would need courage and truth. The night before the stream they checked their tools and held each other like people about to run into wind. Saad met Van in the wings. She was young and quiet but her eyes burned with small fire. She handed them a backup internet feed in a small, plain box and showed where camera angles could not reach. She brought Gary, a small drone she had named after a childhood toy. Gary was cheap and loud and would drop a ribbon into the air to distract the cameras at the right second. Saad warned them of a clause in Steph's manager's rules. Interfere and you will be taken off air fast. The algorithm, she said, could trigger a takedown if it detected unusual traffic. Van nodded and felt the fear buzz in his throat. Kunnel tightened the code until his hands hurt. Tola folded the old invoices into love letters. Baba Ade practiced the rhyme until the sounds fell like small stones. They all stood together and felt a mix of dread and hope. The small drone hummed in Sada's bag as if it knew its part. The plan was messy, low-tech, and full of truth, exactly what they needed. On the day of the stream, the square filled with people holding small cards. Signs read #UnboxTruth in shaky letters. The air felt noisy with phones and nerves. Van took a deep breath and read his grandmother's jam memory into the mic. He passed the mic to a baker who said she secretly hated white frosting, then to a barber who admitted he missed his father. The chat flooded with real replies. Kunnel fed raw comments into his patch and watched the numbers climb. For a while hope felt like a warm blanket. But then the stream counter surged and a warning blinked on Kunnel's screen. Reset threshold near. The FNF mirror server hummed and the group felt the lock breathing down their necks. The machine wanted one big cheer to trigger the trade. Van felt his hands shake and kept passing the mic. People spoke names and small tears fell. The town's honest voices blended into the air. The camera angles changed and the backstage crew watched like a packed audience. The clock ran fast and every second felt like a sharp stone. Sponsorius sensed the truth and lashed out like a trapped animal. The feed filled with auto-filtered lines and slick replies that tried to steal the chat back. The algorithm began to repeat sponsor slogans and smooth smile lines to drown the real voices. Van refused to let the camera's cut silence them. He tore the mic from the stage feed and handed it by hand. People kept speaking in low, aching tones. Tola read invoices as love notes to the town. Baba Aid's chant tangled with server noise like a stick stuck in gears. Kunal pushed raw comments faster and faster into the intake. Saad flew Gary low and the drone dropped a ribbon of handwritten names in front of the lens. Backstage, Steph wore a strange calm and announced a special reveal, the kind that made the air thick. The warehouse counter began a final countdown and alarms started to wail faintly. The machine wanted to lock and take the names. The square held its breath, the ribbons fluttered, and the voices grew louder, raw and messy and true. The air smelled like dust and courage. Petra, Tola found one last page buried in a contract drawer. The words on it felt like a trap described plainly at last. The contract said Steph must hit engagement targets by offering resets that traded one authenticity node at each threshold. Nodes were tiny things, a name, a first song, a small memory. The goods had been made from compressed truths, signed and stamped with the smile. Van pulled a panel off the Sponsorious statue and found dozens of USBs and wires feeding a golden urn named Authenticity Bank. The urn glowed faintly and a meter read emptying, 8%, next reset, 60 seconds. Van felt the room tilt. He knew then that the beads and spoons were not just goods but containers that held truth inside, waiting to be emptied. Tola read invoices like a spell, Baba Ade chanted the old rhyme, Kunal flooded the intake with raw voices, and Saad dropped ribbons full of names into Gary's camera path. The urn trembled. The server made a high, thin sound and the feed echoed, return what was taken. Steph lunged for the urn, her fingers reaching for any name she could keep. The crowd's chorus rose like a wall and stopped her hand for a breath. Everything felt loud and urgent. Van knew the final move had to be precise and loud with love. He opened his mouth and poured his grandmother's jam story into the mic like a warm light. Tola held up invoices and read them with soft power, turning each bill into a note of care. Baba Aid's nursery chant became a steady drum that pushed the code toward confusion. Kunal kept the raw comments pouring in until the algorithm choked on human mess. Saad flew Gary over the urn and dropped ribbons of names into the camera so the server would see people, not numbers. The urn shook and the meter began to climb. Sponsorious let out a terrible electrical screech as the golden bank filled with voices instead of empty scores. The machine sparks popped and alarms screamed. Steph grabbed for the urn one last time and tried to twist the names into new contracts. But the crowd's voices formed a net and pulled the ribbons back. The screen flashed with a single command from the feed, return what was taken. The ribbons unfurled and drifted into hands. The air felt full of small things returned. Steph lunged for a fresh contract and reached with greedy hands, trying to sign more names away. Van stepped forward. He knocked the urn just a little and it tipped. Ribbons, names and true words spilled like light into the crowd. The live stream broke into 1,000 honest voices and Sponsorious cracked into confetti of error messages and disclaimers. Steph's polished smile split like a poor filter. Her follower number turned into tiny paper birds that rose and flew away. The child who lost jam remembered it again. The broken ring held its shape once more. The spoon warmed without stealing praise. Van wiped flour off his hands from the soup cake mess and felt a soft peace bloom in his chest. He looked at Saad, Kunal, Baba Ade and Tola. He said, if only the friend had known sooner, then he smiled and added, but now we will never sign a deal we cannot read. People laughed and cried together. The town fixed its small losses and kept names safely close. They learned to question bright feeds and to hold truth close. The end felt quiet and whole, like a small light coming back on.